Today, Anthony Albanese informed the press that there'd be no need for a government that he leads to detain refugees because he supports the policy of turnbacks, which would prevent refugees from getting to Australia in the first place. And this was an attempt by Albanese to have it both ways, to both recognise and appeal to the growing horror that many Australians feel at the condition of detention of those refugees still being held, whether onshore in Australia or offshore, but at the same time appealing to the notion that we need to be strong on border protection. And it's underpinned as well by the lie that somehow boat turnbacks prevents the loss of life at sea. Let's be very clear. Labor, for a long time now, has supported both mandatory detention of asylum seekers. In fact, it was Labor that first started the policy some decades ago, and for 5 years now, supported the policy of turnbacks. Now, the policy of turnbacks is now so entrenched in bipartisan policy that even some refugee advocates, and sadly the Greens, while recognising that the policy is wrong, have effectively given up on the possibility of confronting turnbacks directly and calling this policy out and trying to change it. Effectively, they seem to believe that Australians will never accept the idea of people coming by boat to Australia directly. Now let's start at first principles. Not only are boat turnbacks immoral, but they're fundamentally illegal. Illegal on two counts. First, they represent a complete and utter repudiation of the UN Refugee Convention, which says that if someone comes to your door fleeing persecution, then you have an obligation to offer protection. Australia seems to think that the world's refugees should just go to some other country first to make their first claim for asylum. There's no legal basis for that. Secondly, turnbacks conducted in international waters are an act of piracy. There is no basis in international law for Australia to intercept a boat in international waters and to turn it around. Now, in some cases, boats are effectively pushed back to Indonesia, a country that does not recognise the Refugee Convention. But even worse, we've seen asylum seekers from Sri Lanka, particularly Tamils from Sri Lanka, who've attempted to come to Australia directly, not via some other country, have had their boat intercepted, are taken prisoner on an Australian Navy vessel, their boat sunk, and then forcibly returned to the very regime that they are fleeing from. Australia's policy represents the most brutal and degenerate rupture with the Refugee Convention. But unfortunately, we're not alone. Other wealthy industrialised countries are doing the same thing. And we saw that dramatically with Trump's attempt to build the wall. So remember this, for Australia, a maritime country, turnbacks is our version of Trump's wall. And Europe is doing both things as well, both building barriers, walls, fences to keep people out, and also practicing turnbacks at sea. We're seeing the wealthy industrialised countries shut refugees out. And it's worth reflecting on the fact that the policy of turnbacks that both Labor and Liberal now practice is the very policy that Pauline Hanson was advocating in the late 1990s. So bit by bit, Labor and Liberal have adopted the totality of the Hanson project when it comes to refugees. That's where we've got to. Make no mistake. Stop the boats is the modern day catch cry of the White Australia policy. And in fact, Australia has an obligation to help refugees and asylum seekers and to do a whole lot more. Firstly, because we're a wealthy country and we could easily afford to do so. The vast majority of the world's refugees end up in other poorer, less developed countries. Australia could easily afford to look after and protect the refugees who come to our shores begging for our protection. Secondly, Australian foreign policy has actually inflamed and worsened the conflict and the civil strife which has given rise to the worldwide refugee crisis in the first instance. Just 3 examples. Australia was giving military aid to Myanmar during the Rohingya genocide in that country. Australia, along with the United States and the UK, participated in the illegal invasion of Iraq, which cost the lives of some 1 million people, utterly shattered Iraqi society, created the material basis for the emergence of the Islamic State and a whole new wave of refugees. Third example, Australia has been giving diplomatic and military support to the government in Sri Lanka, a regime whose policies and persecution of the Tamil population there meet the contemporary legal definition of genocide. And yet people fleeing that terror are forcibly returned to their tormentors. Australia can and must do better. Australia can dramatically increase its intake. Australia has the resources to do it. Turnbacks don't save lives at sea. Let's be honest. Let's be frank. The real meaning of turnbacks is fuck off and die somewhere else. If you really want to save lives at sea, you organise safe passage to this and other countries. Socialist Alliance has never wavered from that principle. We've always supported, to the hilt, the Refugee Convention. I've been a refugee rights activist for over 20 years now. I'm a founding member of Refugee Rights Action Network here in Fremantle. No crime to seek asylum. Vote 1, Socialist Alliance.